devastating year for those standing up for human rights. We have seen Human Rights Watch saying the Arab Spring has given way to conflict and repression. And what we have seen is, of course, having had the Arab Spring was giving so much hope to many, many, many civil society organizations throughout the world, and at the same time giving enormous fear to very, very, I would say, very conservative governments. So in order to react, this is what you have seen, because they are just fearful of all these masses on the streets again and having overthrowing the government. So this is always this fear of both regime change, which we have known, about any contest which could build up and be a threat to the current government. So therefore we have seen ever more stronger, definitely repression. We have seen from Frontline Defenders, is a strong organization, which have said 130 human rights defenders were killed in the first 10 months of 2014. International Center for Non-Profit Law has legislation proposed in 90 countries to restrict civil society work, and that we also have said already. And CIVICUS Civil Society Watch Report, we have documented threats to freedom of expression, association and assembly in 96 countries in 2014. And that in democracies as well as in non-democracies. And threats from both state as well as from non-state actors. And we have seen 4 really key drivers for that. The first is the global democratic deficit. Freedom House is a big organization from the US, has documented that in the 9th consecutive year is a decline of democracy. And authoritarian states are hardening their controls. And democratic states are busy creating a surveillance society. So you know all what this means. These are sort of drivers by which we see that there is a constant cutting off of democratic space. And then of course obsession with security. The post 9/11 has lowering the standards and scrutiny for funding. Now, what has that to do? Scrutiny for funding. This is definitely, and I would like you to take one of our reports back here. It's only a summary, but CIVICUS prepares each year sort of a flagship report on the state, the health of civil society. And this last year, I mean, the 2014 was really documenting all these threats in the 94 countries. And in 2015, we were concentrating on, not on the legislation, on those issues which we have more here, but also on some of the restrictions, which are namely that civil society has seen a major cut in funding. Because many of those countries which are very, very restrictive to civil society, because they're afraid they bring a foreign agenda into their country, have cut civil society of funding, foreign funding. And most civil society, which is, say, human rights related, is almost funded somehow from foreign donors, be it foundations, sometimes European Union, or other possibility funders. Now, these countries who are very, very constrictive, they are really fearful that with this funding, those people are strengthened which are against their own policies. And therefore, they have cut these fundings into absolutely almost nothing. So if they got, most of them got 100% or at least 90% of their existing budget from foreign funders. Now they have cut it sometimes to 5%. So we had, in Ethiopia, we had very, very strong civil society, independent civil society organizations, the Ethiopian Council for Human Rights. That was cut following the charity law in 2009 to a non-existent 5% budget. And so they had dismissed all their people. And these people were doing nothing but really just recording. And Ethiopia is, if you know, it's a huge, huge country. And while it is at the moment absolutely making I would say, substantive progress in economic development, it lags absolutely behind any civic development. So civil society is still very much under threat, and any independent activist, blogger or journalist have mostly seen themselves in prison or have gone abroad and are in asylum seekers. So having said this, this is an enormous threat. So we have worked already with many countries and have also talked to donors what can be done in order to get civil society, because we need to see that those civil societies, and CIVICUS is very, very much that civil society, particularly in the south, and those who are near the ground, exactly, they need most the funding. Because if they are totally laid off, then exactly that voice is not on the table. And so I think even as a large civil society, what we are an association, we speak very much that civil society on the ground, that local civil society gets the funding necessary. So there is at the moment a huge almost war going on, even in the humanitarian area, because there was last week a big conference as well here in Geneva. And that is sort of what they call the gloves of conflict response affecting humanitarian NGOs. Even in that area, that I would say the large humanitarian NGOs need to hear now, or are hearing from civil society from the ground, that they don't want to be led by the larger umbrella organizations. They want to define their agenda themselves, and they only want to really work together on eye level. And this is very interesting, although among, in a way, civil society, but mostly in the humanitarian area. So we have seen this last week here in Geneva as well. And the fear of people's uprising, I said already, the post-Arab Spring has created this mania from many, many governments to really restrict civil society, who could be any contest, with any contesting voice. Then we see, as another thing is the political and economic elite overlap. We see symptoms of rising inequality, the market fundamentalism as a dominant economic discourse. And out of this, we see that all those organizations, anti-corruption, environmental, land, indigenous rights activists are at risk. So we have seen in the last, particularly in the last 2 years, we have seen very, very, very strongly that all those civil societies who are working on land rights and who are working in the area of extractive industries, if you mind, in the mining area or in many, many, many countries. And that these are very much under risk, and particularly not only sometimes from governments, but they're under risk from non-state actors, from the large transnational organizations who come to the countries and have, a very, very strong agenda which they sell under economic development, but which go totally to the non-inclusion of some of those original civil society, in particular also indigenous peoples' organizations. Is there something wrong here? So, these are some of, I would say, fears and or why we see, the shrinking of civil society space, the rise in fundamentalism, by a failure of global governance. We see that, we see fundamentalism in religions, we see fundamentalism, as you say, from the markets, we see that we have all these challenges everywhere, and particularly in areas where we see that, say, newer human rights areas as LGBTs, minority rights, women's rights, they are very specifically affected by all this. Now, some of the recommendations, very shortly, we are at the moment working actually on our report. So these, I mean, one of the first things what we are hearing now, and actually in many, many ways, in order to strengthen civil society again, is to avoid a very negative narrative, particular, which is almost disempowering. So civil society does not say anything if they are called their foreign agents. No, they are agents of change. They are agents to help the people. They are agents to bring people back to a dignified life. They are agents to really, we have to constantly bring this very positive agenda into the discussion. Now I hear an echo. Is this not? It's all right? Yeah. Now the other ones are very much more technical. I think the creating the new narrative is definitely a very, very powerful recommendation. And also, that we are developing ways to track and measure civic space. That comes what CIVICUS is now doing. We have various measures. We have, first of all, the yearly annual report. We will soon have a pulse, which is feeling the pulse of civil society worldwide, by creating just a few questions which are being led throughout the world to civil society organizations. How are you free to speak out? What is the state of freedom of assembly, the rights to peaceful protest? I mean, these very fundamental rights for civil society to act and to do its work. How is the situation about this? And if we get this, say, quarterly, in a way, then we can really see what is happening, and we want to create this worldwide. And the other one is we also create a data shift that we want to see in action as helping to implement these SDGs, because they all have talked, we need to have a data revolution in order to get really data. We have, I think, a civil society since years and years, since the Beijing Conference for Women, we have also spoken on a segregated data, but now we are speaking even more on a very, I would say, data which comes directly from the ground, which people, civil society itself is creating because they are near to it, and that it comes to afterwards to a worldwide data collection from civil society, which then goes hand in hand with national data, but not without civil society. I mean, there are, at each national you have statisticians who bring sort of data together, but these are measured by any given criteria, and now they have never looked maybe into all those who have been neglected, who have never been put into this kind of criteria. And we want to see, I mean, exactly with the help of what we have heard, leave no one behind. That is some of those premises of the SDGs, leave no one behind, that this data will be created. So for that, we need to see and have this huge data shift, which is about to be, is already in the state with some, in the pilot state with some 6-7 countries at the moment. So we have other ways to developing progress, norms, research to expose corrupt connections. Yes, that is definitely also to see, to have much more research on the table on all restrictions. And to have solidarity at all levels is crucial. Yeah, that is definitely a time and time again that we have horizontal and other solidarity levels, and that is constantly, I mean, if it's UPR, if it's any kind of civil society, we need to work together. We need to, for that, which is very difficult, to come out of our different silos. And we have, more or less, civil society is, of course, diverse. We work on different issues, and sometimes we are just sitting in these silos where we are working in. And so what we are seeing is we have very specific human rights activists which work and who work mostly in the human rights area, but we have never sort of worked together with development NGOs or with environmental NGOs. And we cannot work, we don't have the capacity to be all, but we need to be open, need to have, that it flows from one silo into the next, that we are living in a complex world, and for that we need to also be open to see that the different, these different strengths come into us and we react to this. And this is definitely a challenge. But I mean, this challenge needs to be just loud enough, because we are living in a globalized world. We have seen which technologies have, in a relatively short time, changed the world. So I think there is a possibility that we need to work also into having more possibilities and capacities to take these different issues, still with the major issue of having a dignified life for all. And that means leaving nobody behind. And that means also giving civil society that space that it needs to do its work. And now I wanted to ask you what you understand by space. And I say space, as we understand it, is just the area. When you see, I mean, if you see society, there is government, there is a family, and there is business, and there is civil society. And this is like an arena. So civil society can also maybe also be in the family, can also be in the business, but enters into that area where it works together with others for the good of other people. That's this area of civil society. And if that space needs to be protected. And we have just heard, I mean, yesterday, actually, there was the special rapporteur on freedom of association and assembly, Maina Kiai. I don't know if you heard the name. He's from Kenya, a great guy. He has just delivered one of his last reports to the General Assembly, actually, on, I mean, his mandate is just the freedoms of assembly and peaceful assembly and association. And yesterday he spoke actually on the, I would say, environment which is laid out for business and for civil society. In which way is it equally, not equally in the same, but in terms of giving at least the recognition from the government that civil society needs just the same good possibilities to register, to do its work, to have whatever they need to do as it does for what it lays out for business. And he has given me huge and hundreds of examples where in countries where business wants to be created in, can be registered in 2 hours, and it takes months and years for an association to be registered. So, I mean, this kind of different ways, and I think it's a wonderful way to establish that civil society has a space in any society. And it just needs to be constantly recognized, and it needs to be recognized by all the partners. So we have to work on that. I want to be recognized by all the partners. So we have to work on that. I want to finish here and just see if you have any questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Renate, for this quite substantial presentation. Ne marche pas? Ah, ok.
Take this over.
Okay, well, thank you, Renate, for having given us this quite substantial presentation on these issues, the trends that we see actually in this field. We can witness this almost every day, unfortunately, when we listen to the news, but also some of the proposals. Perhaps just one point which you've made, and I just want to underline that because it's quite important. What you have just said about the question of human rights activists and the rest of civil society. We must be very clear, because it's a bit of a trend sometimes within our own organization, to make an equation between human rights organization equals civil society, which is not the case. Civil society is a much wider issue, which includes the development organizations, whatever, technical, IT, environment organization, and so on. And so it's quite important, but we do play, as human rights activists, an important role precisely in what you said, in the regulation of the civil society. So I think here we have a specific role, and the fact that this issue is in a way included in the UPR process is quite important. One of the problems we have, though, is that as such, civil society is not recognized in human rights in general. Human rights are rights given to the individuals. There is very few collective rights, except the ones we've talked about previously, like indigenous people. But there are very little collective rights which are recognized as such. So here we have one of the difficulty with the instruments we are using as human rights activists, and also one we are reporting about in the UPR process. That is, it is linked to the individual actions and not to the collective space. And states are precisely playing on this difference, because they say, oh, we are giving individual rights, but when we're talking about movement, association, it's something which is different, and so on. So that report you were mentioning is very important. The work that you are doing here is extremely important, because we have to try to develop more and more this concept of the civil society at the basis in general. And that's why this small reference in the UPR, which seems so small, and for some of you, as you said, oh, but they don't really do what they are supposed to do, which is absolutely true, and we're very aware of that. But to come and use it and repeat it again and again is extremely important, because we don't have that many tools where you would have a formal recognition of the space of civil society, as it was just said. So I think this is quite important, and I think it was very useful to have this discussion. Now, I'm sure you have reactions, perhaps testimonies about what's happening in your own place, or questions. So let's go for a round of raise of hands. Let's start with Natalia. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. My question would be related to Ukrainian context. In Ukraine right now we have conflict in East, and Ukraine has made a statement regarding the withdrawal of observance of some international human rights instrument, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to covenants, international covenants on civil and political rights, and on cultural and economic rights, as well as regional instruments like European Convention on Human Rights. Of course, not rights but some like freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, and some other very important rights. Would it be somehow reflected in UPR revision? Because obviously the civil society organization would still report about such violation, and the state, to some extent, on some territory, on some parts of the territory, cannot fulfill its positive obligations to protect these rights. Are there any instruments envisaged by UPR, so kind of that it would be noted that due to the conflict in the area, this right cannot be, and the state, when it would make any responses to the recommendations, or are there any instruments that would reflect such situation? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. I'm Frances Algali. I come from Sierra Leone. I just want to talk about civil society space from the first cycle of the UPR to the second cycle of the UPR, in terms of how they have participated and how they have contributed. Because for me, the UPR is essentially a political, it's a political process. It really depends on the political will of the particular regime and how it sees the process to bring on board other stakeholders. And from the first cycle to the second cycle, in my own context, I have seen a wane in the political will and the momentum of the UPR. And that has affected the participation of civil society organizations. All what you said in your organization is true. It's as if the governments have learned how to manipulate the process in such a way that they now have their own civil society organizations. They now have consultants writing these reports. They can now manipulate the consultations and all of that. So for the second cycle, there seems to be a wane in how the process is going on from our own perspective. So is your organization aware of this, or are you looking at this as something that needs to be tackled?
Hello, I'm Kripa, and I'm from Nepal. Thank you so much for your presentation. I've actually worked with human rights defenders from the global south. So I have like few experiences as well when it came to being open about using human rights in their language. We had this training on women's economic, social, culture rights, and we were supposed to get a participant from China. She was from Tibet. She was Tibetan origin, but she could not even say human rights. When we had this webinar, she had to use words like women empowerment and not say rights even. And afterwards, like, she disappeared for almost 1-2 months, and we were really scared what happened to her. We got to know that she was actually interrogated by the cops there, and she had to completely run away from her place. She even lost her job. So that is the tendency of Chinese government, how her own phone was tapped. That is one. Two, in India, most of the well-known organizations came into a radar, and they were blacklisted, because it was said that they were working against the national interest, and their accounts were even frozen, so they could not even get foreign funding. So how does that restrict our own work in terms of human rights? Third is, we worked with Ethiopian human rights defenders. They just came for a training in another country, and it was found out that they went for human rights training and they had to be exiled from the country itself. So my question is, yes, we call ourselves as human rights defenders, but when it comes to reality, when it comes to practicing human rights in reality, they don't really have that kind of freedom. So when it comes to me, when I'm in threat, what do I exactly do? And we're talking about UPR and getting involved in the process. But when it comes to my own life, like death threat, then what exactly can we do in those situations where we can actually say human rights without even any fear? Like, I would like your answer for that. Thank you.